Open it, now. Or I will have this entire property cited before noon.
No.
That was the whole conversation, 30 seconds. A blocked road, and a woman who had just made the worst decision of her adult life without realizing it. Melissa Grant stood in front of my driveway at 7:14 on a Saturday morning, her phone camera pointed directly at my face, two HOA board members parked in their SUVs across the only road out of the community behind her, and she smiled like she'd already won. I let her smile, because I had spent 20 years as a combat engineer learning one thing above everything else. The most dangerous trap is the one the target builds themselves, one confident step at a time. And Melissa had just picked up the shovel. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at her camera, still recording, still pointed at me, and I thought, keep it running. You're going to want all of this. What she didn't know, standing there in that embroidered HOA vest with her binder and her witnesses and her borrowed authority, was that I wasn't the one who needed to be worried about what happened next. She was. If you already know the other person is digging their own grave, do you hand them a ladder? Or do you quietly hand them a bigger shovel? My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 51 years old, and I am not, by any reasonable definition, a difficult neighbor. I don't throw parties. I don't let my lawn go. I don't park on the street, leave trash cans out past collection day, or let my dogs bark past 9. I wave when I see people. I shovel my section of sidewalk without being asked. For 3 years after I moved into this ranch-style property outside Fort Collins, I was the kind of resident an HOA president should theoretically love. Quiet, maintained, invisible. I'd bought the house specifically because it wasn't complicated. After 2 decades as a combat engineer, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, 18 months in a training command in Germany, I was done with complicated. I wanted land, quiet mornings, a workbench in the garage, a property that didn't share walls with anyone. The house came with a bonus feature that most buyers had apparently found strange. A reinforced underground shelter about 40 feet from the back fence line, originally built by the previous owner as a tornado refuge, which I had converted into a secure storage room. It held emergency supplies, water, MREs, a generator, fuel canisters stored according to fire code. It held hard copies of important documents, deeds, contracts, service records, financial records going back to my discharge. And it held roughly $60,000 worth of consulting equipment, specialized sensors, ruggedized laptops, calibration tools I used for the private engineering firm I'd run since leaving the Army. The shelter was climate-controlled, alarmed, and built like a small vault. It was also completely invisible from the street, accessed by a flush-mounted hatch inside a fenced section of my backyard. Nobody had ever cared about it before Melissa. My daily rhythm was simple. I was up at 5:30. Coffee made by 5:40, an hour of reading or paperwork before the world got loud. I kept a logbook on my desk, a habit from the Army that I'd never fully dropped, where I noted anything relevant. Consultations, expenses, maintenance, dates. I kept my email organized by thread and date. I kept receipts. I kept records the way some people keep grudges. Automatically, without much thought, as simple discipline. I had a 4-camera security system on the property, motion-activated, cloud-backed, with a 72-hour rolling archive that I could pull from any device. Not because I was paranoid, because I was an engineer. Because when things go wrong, timestamps matter. I mention all of this not to impress anyone. I mention it because the kind of person you are before a fight determines everything about how the fight ends. And I had been quietly, boringly, methodically becoming the worst possible target for someone like Melissa Grant for 3 years before she ever pointed a camera at my face. I have a rule I picked up somewhere between Fallujah and Fort Bragg, and it goes like this. Never spend a grenade on a problem that a conversation can solve, but never mistake patience for permission. Most people get one or the other wrong. The ones who spend the grenade too early make noise, win the moment, and lose the war. They escalate before the other side has finished building their case against themselves. They give people a reason to feel sympathy for the wrong party. They turn a clear-cut situation into a messy he said, she said, where nobody looks clean. I've seen it happen in military disputes, contract negotiations, neighborhood disagreements. Someone gets legitimately wronged. They react too fast, and suddenly the story becomes about their reaction instead of the original wrong. The ones who mistake patience for permission let things slide until sliding becomes the default. They absorb one overreach, then another, and by the time they decide enough is enough, they've spent so long absorbing that people have forgotten what the original line even was. Neither one works. What works, what has always worked in my experience, is a specific kind of stillness. Not passivity, not strategy theater. Just the genuine, disciplined practice of watching something unfold without putting your fingerprints on it before you need to, letting a situation develop until it's fully, unambiguously, undeniably what it is. Because a half-built case is a dismissed case, and a dismissed case is worse than no case at all. It tells the other side they can keep going. I had watched Melissa operate for the better part of a year before she turned her attention to me. I had watched her send written notices to homeowners for decorative flags, for a wind chime, for a basketball hoop set 3 inches closer to the street than the guideline specified. A guideline she had introduced herself at a board meeting attended by 11 people, 4 of whom were her own appointees. I had watched her fine a retired schoolteacher twice in 1 month over a garden bed border that she had personally measured with a tape she brought from home. I had watched all of this and filed it the way I file everything, quietly, in order, with dates. Not because I was planning anything. Because I had learned, a long time ago in places with much higher stakes than a homeowners association in northern Colorado, that the people who abuse small amounts of power do not stop. They do not reach a point of satisfaction and settle. They escalate. Every time they get away with something, the floor moves. What was aggressive becomes normal. What was normal becomes the minimum. And they keep going until something stops them. Or until they run far enough out over the edge that the ground simply isn't there anymore. Melissa had been running for a while. She just hadn't looked down yet. Does patience in the face of injustice mean you're in control? Or does it only feel that way until someone takes it for weakness? Let me tell you what was actually in that shelter. Not because it matters to the story legally, it doesn't, but because it matters to understanding what Melissa was actually threatening when she pointed her camera at that hatch and demanded I open it. The emergency supplies were the least of it. Water, food, a generator, fuel, replaceable, insurable, unremarkable. What wasn't replaceable were the document files. 30 years of personal and professional records, organized in fireproof cases, my discharge papers, father's will, the original deed to this property, which had a surveying dispute attached to it, that I had spent 14 months resolving with the county, and whose resolution depended entirely on a set of original survey documents that existed nowhere else. Copies are accepted in most proceedings. They are not accepted in all of them. Then there was the equipment. My consulting work required tools that are not sold at retail. Specialized ground-penetrating sensors, ruggedized field computers with proprietary calibration software locked to their hardware IDs. A set of precision instruments I had purchased through a decommissioned government contract and spent 2 years getting recertified for civilian use. If any of it were seized, even temporarily, even wrongly, even for a single week while a dispute worked its way through whatever process Melissa imagined she could set in motion, I would lose active contracts. I would miss deliverables. I would breach agreements that had penalty clauses attached to them. The financial exposure wasn't theoretical. It was specific. It had a number, and beyond the money, the shelter itself. I had converted it. I had permitted it. I had every document related to every modification I had ever made to it, filed in chronological order, in a binder that sat on the second shelf to the left of the door. Any suggestion that it contained something dangerous, anything that triggered a formal investigation, anything that created a public record associating my name and my property with a safety complaint, even a false one, even one that was ultimately dismissed, would follow me. In consulting, reputation is the contract. Clients don't hire engineers who show up in county complaint logs. Melissa didn't know any of this. She saw a hatch in the ground and a neighbor who hadn't flinched at her fines. She thought she'd found leverage. What she'd actually found was the one thing I genuinely could not afford to let go. Which meant she had also found the one situation in which I was absolutely not going to stop until it was finished completely. The Saturday morning confrontation didn't come out of nowhere. Looking back, I can trace the exact moment Melissa decided I was a problem worth solving. It was a Tuesday evening, 6 weeks earlier. I had attended the monthly HOA board meeting, something I did maybe twice a year, when the agenda included items that affected my property directly. That night's agenda included a proposed amendment to the community guidelines regarding accessory structures, which the notice defined vaguely enough that I wanted to hear the language in person before it passed. Melissa ran the meeting the way I imagined she ran most things, efficiently, confidently, and with just enough procedural complexity to make dissent feel exhausting. She moved through agenda items at a pace that discouraged questions. When a homeowner named Patricia, a retired school teacher who had already been fined twice that month, tried to ask about the amendment's specific definitions, Melissa talked over her twice before the woman simply sat back down. I asked one question. I asked what the amendment's enforcement mechanism was for structures that predated the new guidelines. Melissa looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized immediately. Not irritation. Calculation. Existing structures would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, she said, at the board's discretion. I nodded and wrote it down. That was all I did. I wrote it down, dated it, and left. But I noticed something that evening that I hadn't paid close attention to before. After the meeting, standing in the parking lot while residents filtered out, I watched Melissa speak quietly to both board members, a man named Doug Fielding and a woman named Carol Hess, while glancing once in my direction. It wasn't hostile. It was the kind of look that precedes a decision, not a reaction. 3 days later, I received my first written notice from the HOA. It cited a potential code concern regarding underground modifications to the property and requested documentation of any permits related to subsurface structures. The language was careful, technically framed. Not a fine, not yet, just a request. I pulled every permit document I had, confirmed they were complete, and filed the notice in a new folder I labeled with the date. Then, over the next 2 weeks, 3 of my immediate neighbors told me, separately, in the kind of low-voiced way people talk when they're not sure who's listening, that they'd received questions from Melissa about my property. Had they seen unusual activity? Had they noticed deliveries? Did they know what was kept underground? She was building something, not a safety case, a file. And here was the thing that told me this wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't a new president overreaching by accident, wasn't a bureaucratic reflex that would correct itself. She was asking neighbors before she had asked me. She was collecting testimony before she had established a complaint. She was constructing a story, and she needed witnesses in place before the story officially began. That is not how a confused person operates. That is how a person operates when they already know what conclusion they want and are working backward to the evidence. I started a second folder that same evening. When someone begins gathering witnesses before they've filed a complaint, is that due diligence, or is that something else entirely? The morning she blocked the road, after the sheriff's deputies arrived and ordered the SUVs moved, Melissa did something I hadn't expected. She smiled at the lead deputy, a calm, practiced smile, and said she was simply conducting a routine community safety check and hadn't realized the vehicles were causing an obstruction. She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. Apologetic tone, zero apology in the eyes. The deputy looked at her. Then, at the 2 SUVs that had been parked bumper to bumper across the only road out of a 42-home community. Then back at her. He didn't push it. He had no grounds to, technically. No formal complaint had been filed. No law had been broken beyond some aggressive parking. The road was cleared. I was free to leave. On paper, it ended there. I stayed. I had already called ahead and rescheduled my consulting job. And I had a decision to make standing in my driveway in the morning light while Melissa's SUV pulled slowly to the curb, and she sat inside it, watching me through the windshield. I could have escalated right then. I had enough for a harassment complaint, the blocked road, the recorded demand for access to private property, the written notice sent before any formal process had been initiated, the neighbor interviews she'd conducted behind my back. A lawyer could have done something with that package. Maybe enough to get her removed. Maybe enough for a civil filing. Maybe just enough to make her back down. I didn't do it. Not because I doubted the case, because the case wasn't finished. What I had was a collection of aggressive moves that she could individually explain away. The notice was routine. The neighbor questions were community outreach. The blocked road was an honest mistake. Each piece, in isolation, had a defense. And a person like Melissa, someone who had been operating this way for months without consequence, would use every one of those defenses fluently because she'd probably already rehearsed them. I needed her to keep going. I walked back inside, poured a second cup of coffee, and sent her a single email at 9:47 that morning. I kept it to 4 sentences. I stated that the HOA had no legal authority to demand access to private storage areas inside a homeowner's property. I stated that blocking a community access road could constitute unlawful obstruction. I stated that I had documented the morning's events and retained a copy. And I closed with one sentence that I chose very carefully. I'd strongly suggest the board review the boundaries of its authority before taking any further action regarding my property. I sent it from my primary email. I blind copied my personal attorney. Then I opened my logbook and wrote down the time. She had been warned. Clearly, in writing, with a timestamp from an address tied to my legal name. Whatever came next was going to be entirely her choice. If you hand someone a map showing exactly where the line is, and they cross it anyway, does that count as a mistake or a decision? She didn't write back. What she did instead told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. Within 72 hours of my email, 3 things happened in sequence. First, an anonymous complaint was filed with Larimer County citing possible hazardous material storage at my address. Second, the HOA posted a notice on the community board, the physical cork board near the mailboxes, where everyone could see it, announcing a safety review of certain properties pending resident concerns. Third, Patricia, the retired schoolteacher 2 doors down, told me quietly over her fence that Melissa had knocked on her door the previous evening and asked whether she had ever noticed unusual smells or chemical odors coming from my yard. Patricia had told her no. She also told me that Melissa had seemed annoyed by that answer. I thanked Patricia. I went inside. I wrote all 3 events in my logbook with times, dates, and sources. And I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just a kind of cold clarity that I recognized from fieldwork. The clarity that arrives when a situation stops being ambiguous. When the pattern finishes assembling itself and you can see the whole shape of it. Melissa wasn't harassing me because she genuinely believed there was a safety risk. If she believed that, she would have engaged the county directly from the start, let the process run, and stayed out of it personally. Instead, she was manufacturing the appearance of a safety risk, planting the idea in neighbors' minds, filing anonymous complaints to create a paper trail, using the HOA notice board to attach a public stigma to my property before any investigation had concluded anything. She was trying to build a reputation problem I'd have to spend time and money correcting. What she was actually building was a documented pattern of coordinated bad faith conduct with her name on every piece of it. I added a 3rd folder to the stack on my desk. I labeled it County Filings. The rope was getting longer, and she was the one holding the other end. The county complaint triggered a standard inspection request. A Larimer County code enforcement officer named Dale Hutchins called me 4 days after the filing and asked if he could schedule a walkthrough of the property. I said yes immediately. I offered him the earliest available slot. I met him at the gate with every permit document organized in chronological order, tabbed and labeled. In a binder I handed him before he'd taken 3 steps onto the property. Dale was a methodical man in his late 50s who had clearly done this job long enough to recognize the difference between an actual hazard and a paperwork ambush. He walked the exterior, inspected the shelter entrance, reviewed the permits, checked the fuel storage against state fire code, and spent approximately 4 minutes underground before emerging and writing a single line in his inspection log. No violations found. Storage compliant with all applicable codes. He signed it. I asked for a copy on the spot. He gave me one. I filed it under county filings and made 2 additional copies. One for my attorney, one for a separate offsite folder I kept at my office. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my attorney, Marcus Webb, who had been following the situation since I'd blind copied him on the email. I walked him through the sequence. The board meeting, the written notice, the blocked road, the anonymous county complaint, the neighbor interviews. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Keep going exactly as you're going. Don't respond to anything else in writing without running it by me first. And Ethan, don't stop documenting." The second call was to a security systems consultant I'd worked with on a previous contract. I asked him to quietly audit my existing camera setup and advise on whether my network was broadcasting any signals detectable from outside my property line. He told me my system was clean. He also told me, as a side note, that my security software was configured to log any unauthorized devices that attempted to connect to networks within range of my property. I asked him to make sure that logging function was active and set to retain data indefinitely. The third call was to Patricia. I asked her, very gently, whether she would be willing to write down what Melissa had asked her, just for her own records. She said she already had. I hadn't asked her to. She'd done it on her own, because something had felt wrong enough to document. That told me I wasn't the only one who had noticed the shape of what was happening. The clean inspection report should have ended it. It didn't. Within 10 days of Dale Hutchins signing off on my property, The HOA issued 2 new written notices. The first cited unresolved aesthetic concerns regarding my back fence line, specifically a section of cedar board fencing that had been in place since before I purchased the property and had passed the HOA's own inspection during my closing process 3 years prior. The second cited ongoing community concerns regarding subsurface modifications and announced that the board was commissioning an independent structural assessment of underground features in the community at homeowner expense to be billed proportionally across all residents. That second notice was the one that mattered, because it meant Melissa had found a way to make the clean inspection irrelevant. She wasn't disputing the county's findings. She was simply routing around them, creating a parallel process controlled by the HOA, funded by residents, answerable to no one except the board she ran. If the independent assessor found nothing, she could quietly shelve the results. If they found anything at all, a minor permit gap, an outdated classification, anything, she could use it. And in the meantime, every homeowner in the community was receiving documents that associated my address with the phrase ongoing community concerns. I received 3 text messages that week from neighbors I barely knew. 2 were cautiously supportive. 1 was not. One man named Gary, who lived on the far end of the community and had apparently never spoken to me directly in 3 years of proximity, sent me a message informing me that he didn't appreciate whatever was going on with my property affecting his HOA fees. I didn't respond to Gary. I photographed both notices, logged the dates, and forwarded everything to Marcus. He called back within the hour. His exact words were, "She just billed the entire community for a personal vendetta and put it in writing." That's a gift, Ethan. Don't unwrap it yet, I didn't. But I noted something I hadn't fully registered until that moment. Every aggressive move Melissa made left a document. A notice, a filing, a signed board decision, a paper trail with her name attached to every page. She thought she was building a case against me. She was building something else entirely. The quarterly HOA meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse. A beige room with folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, and a projector screen. Melissa had requisitioned from HOA funds the previous spring. 41 of 42 households received notice. I was the 42nd. My notice arrived 2 days after the meeting had already taken place. I found out about this from Patricia, who had attended and called me the following morning with a voice that sat somewhere between outrage and exhaustion. She told me what had happened. Melissa had opened the meeting by presenting what she called a community safety summary. She had used the projector. She had displayed a slide with my address on it, my full address, in large font, centered on the screen, beneath a header that read, "Unresolved Property Concerns, Active Review." She had told the assembled residents that the board had received multiple reports of potential safety issues related to underground storage at my property. She had stated, in front of every neighbor I had, that the county inspection had been inconclusive, which was a direct, provable lie. Dale Hutchins's report said no violations found in plain English, signed and dated. Then she had opened the floor to questions. And according to Patricia, Doug Fielding, board member, Melissa's appointee, had stood up and said, "Frankly, if a neighbor has nothing to hide, opening the shelter for a board review shouldn't be a problem. The fact that Mr. Walker has refused every reasonable request speaks for itself." Patricia said the room had gone quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when people are uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak. I listened to all of this without interrupting. When Patricia finished, I asked her one question. "Was anyone recording the meeting?" She paused. "I think Carol had her phone out. And the Hendersons usually record for their own notes. They stream to their home tablet for their son who has mobility issues." I thanked her. I asked her to please not reach out to the Hendersons yet. I said I would handle it. Then I opened my logbook and wrote down Doug Fielding's exact words as Patricia had reported them, with her name, the date, and the time of her call. "Refuses every reasonable request, a public statement, made in front of witnesses, about a documented, cleared inspection. If there was a more efficient way to hand someone a defamation exhibit, I hadn't seen it in 51 years. How much does someone have to trust their own authority before they'll say something that's false in a room full of witnesses?" 2 weeks after the meeting I hadn't been invited to, Melissa went institutional. She retained a law firm, a small outfit in Fort Collins that specialized in HOA governance, and had them send me a formal letter demanding access to the shelter for an independent structural and safety assessment within 30 days, or face escalating fines of $250 per day. The letter cited 3 HOA bylaw sections, 2 of which she had amended herself within the past 8 months, and 1 of which didn't exist in the original governing documents at all. I checked. I had the original documents. The section number she cited skipped from 14.7 to 14.9 in the version filed with the county clerk. 14.8, the section her lawyers were citing as authority, had been inserted sometime in the intervening months. I forwarded the letter to Marcus with a single note, see section 14.8. He called back laughing. Not because it was funny, but because it was the kind of thing that only happens when someone is so confident in their own authority that they stop checking whether the foundation is real. Marcus sent a response on my behalf within 48 hours. It was courteous, precise, and devastating in the particular way that legal correspondence is devastating when it simply lists facts in order. It noted that Section 14.8 did not appear in the governing documents on file with Larimer County as of the date the HOA had last submitted updated bylaws. It noted that any bylaw amendment required a formal vote of the membership with proper notice, and requested documentation of when and how 14.8 had been adopted. It requested the complete amendment history for all bylaw changes made during Melissa's tenure. And it stated clearly that until the legal basis for the access demand was established, no access would be granted. Melissa's lawyers went quiet for 11 days. Then the fine started anyway. $250 first notice, filed, photographed, logged. $500 second notice 2 weeks later, filed, photographed, logged. And alongside the fines, something new. A contractor's van appeared outside my property on a Tuesday morning. 2 men I didn't recognize spent 40 minutes walking my fence line with a clipboard, photographing the exterior of my property from the easement. When I stepped outside and asked who had authorized the assessment, one of them showed me a work order signed by Melissa Grant, HOA president, dated 3 days prior. I photographed the work order with my phone while he was still holding it. He didn't object. I don't think he understood why I was smiling. Because the work order listed a billing address. The billing address was the HOA's operating account, which meant Melissa had authorized private contractors to conduct assessments of individual homeowner properties and was billing assessments to community funds. Funds collected from all 42 households, without a board vote, without member notice, without any of the procedural requirements the HOA's own bylaws required for expenditures above $500. I called Marcus that afternoon. He said, "She just spent community money on a personal investigation without authorization. That's potential fiduciary breach. Get me a copy of that work order." I already had it. I also had something else by then. Something I hadn't told Marcus about yet, because it was still developing. Something that had started 3 days earlier, when my security system flagged an unauthorized device connecting to a network within range of my backyard. A wireless camera, mounted in the elm tree on the easement side of my back fence, pointed directly at the shelter hatch. I didn't touch the camera. I didn't report it. I didn't photograph it from the outside. I didn't mention it to Patricia, or to Marcus, or to anyone. I walked back inside, poured coffee, and sat at my kitchen table for a long time thinking about what it meant that someone had placed an unauthorized surveillance device on a public easement specifically aimed at private property, and what it meant that they'd done it while already under a documented pattern of bad faith conduct. What it meant technically was a criminal matter. Unauthorized surveillance of a private residence in Colorado carries real consequences. But consequences require evidence, and evidence requires patience, and patience required me to do the thing that went against every instinct I had trained over 2 decades of fieldwork. Leave it alone. Let it run. I called my security consultant instead. I asked him to tell me everything the system could capture from a device like the one now sitting in my elm tree. Not just what it could see, but what it could hear, and whether audio transmitted over its network connection could be logged from my side without interfering with its operation. He walked me through it for 40 minutes. The answer, in short, was yes. Under specific conditions, with the right configuration, anything the device transmitted within range of my system could be captured and time-stamped. I asked him to set that up quietly. He did it remotely that same afternoon. But here is the part that stayed with me longer than the camera itself. 2 days after I found the device, Doug Fielding knocked on my front door. He stood on my porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and a look on his face that I had seen before. The look of a man who has been adjacent to something long enough to feel its weight, but not long enough to have done anything about it. He didn't say much. he asked, in a voice kept carefully low, whether things had gotten out of hand. He said he wanted me to know he had voted against the independent assessment billing. He said some of the board decisions lately had made him uncomfortable. He did not say he would do anything. He did not offer to go on record. He just stood there on my porch telling me, in the careful language of a man protecting himself, that he knew more than he was saying and was choosing not to say it. I thanked him for stopping by. I closed the door and wrote down every word he'd said with the time and the date. How many people watch something go wrong from close enough to stop it, and choose instead to just make sure they're not standing in the blast radius when it finally lands? By the 5th week, the fines had accumulated to $4,250 on paper. Melissa's law firm had sent a third letter, this one seed to the HOA's insurance carrier, stating that failure to comply with the access demand within 14 days would result in the board pursuing a lien against my property. A lien against a property I owned outright, with no mortgage, clear title, and a clean inspection report from a county official sitting in a labeled folder on my desk. Marcus told me the lien threat was almost certainly unenforceable, given the bylaw amendment issues we'd already identified. Almost certainly. In law, that phrase does real work. It means there exists a version of events where you are right about everything and still spend 18 months in procedural limbo, while a lien notation sits attached to your deed and your consulting clients run background checks that flag encumbered properties as risk factors. I had 2 active contracts up for renewal in the next 30 days. One of them involved a federal subcontracting relationship that required a clean property and financial background check as a condition of continuation. I had never failed one of those checks in 11 years of consulting. The thought of failing one because of a fraudulent lien filed by a woman in an embroidered vest was the closest I came, during this entire period, to genuine anger. I sat with it for about 10 minutes. Then I went back to work. Because here is what I also knew by the end of week 5. The camera in the elm tree had been running for 23 days. In that time, my security system had logged 41 separate audio and video transmissions from the device. Most were unremarkable. Footage of my backyard, my fence line, the shelter hatch sitting undisturbed exactly as it always had. But 11 of those transmissions had captured something else. Something Melissa had not planned for when she'd installed a wireless camera that used her own network credentials and transmitted back to her own cloud storage account. Conversations. Whenever she or another board member accessed the camera feed remotely, checking it from a phone or laptop within range of a shared network, the audio from their end of the session sometimes bled into the transmission log. Fragments, partial sentences, enough to establish context, not always enough to establish specifics. But 3 of those 11 fragments were not fragments. 3 of them were full conversations, clearly audible, captured in their entirety, because whoever was reviewing the feed had been careless about background noise and proximity to an open microphone. I had listened to all 3 twice. I had not yet told Marcus what was on them. I was waiting for one more thing, one specific piece I needed before the picture was complete enough to be undeniable rather than merely damning. The 14-day deadline was in 9 days. The camera had been running for 23. And Melissa had a monthly HOA Zoom meeting, scheduled for the following Thursday evening. The Thursday Zoom meeting started at 7 p.m. I attended under my own name, camera off, microphone muted, from my home office. 31 households joined. Melissa ran the meeting from what looked like her kitchen table, a ring light casting her face in flat white, her HOA binder open in front of her, a glass of water at her elbow. She was confident, visibly, almost physically confident, the kind of confidence that comes from believing you have already won and are simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She opened with community announcements, landscaping schedule, pool maintenance, a reminder about parking regulations during the upcoming holiday weekend. Normal, routine, the kind of meeting that makes people forget why they joined. 40 minutes in, she moved to new business. She pulled up a screen share. What she intended to show, I later learned from Patricia, was a summary document she had prepared regarding the ongoing property compliance review. A tidy presentation. Dates, notices, correspondence, her version of events formatted for an audience. What she showed instead was her desktop, not the presentation file. Her full desktop, icon grid, open browser tabs, a file explorer window she hadn't closed sitting front and center on the screen. And in that file explorer window, visible to 31 households on a shared Zoom session for approximately 8 seconds before she realized what had happened and killed the share, were folders. Labeled folders: target homes, Q3, find strategy, active, property acquisition, prospects, legal leverage, do not forward. 8 seconds. I had been recording the Zoom session from the moment it started. Standard practice, I record every meeting I attend. The recording caught all 8 seconds in full resolution, including the folder names, including the File Explorer path, showing they were stored locally on a device logged into Melissa Grant's HOA administrator account. The chat window erupted immediately. 15 simultaneous messages in under a minute. What was that? Can you go back? What do those folders say? Melissa recovered quickly, apologized for the technical difficulty, said she'd opened the wrong window, moved on with visible composure to the next agenda item. 3 people had already left the meeting. 2 more left while she was still talking. But here is what mattered more than the folders themselves. In the 48 hours following the Zoom meeting, my security system logged 6 separate transmissions from the camera in the elm tree. All 6 were longer than usual, all 6 captured audio, and in 2 of them, captured while Melissa and Carol Hess reviewed the camera feed together from what sounded like Melissa's home. I had clear, complete, unambiguous recordings of the following. Melissa stating that 2 specific properties on the east side of the community were being assessed for acquisition potential, and that fines were being structured to create motivation to sell. Carol asking whether the camera on my property had picked up anything useful yet. Melissa saying not yet, but it will. And when it does, we won't need the lawyers anymore. I sat in my office for a long time after that. Then I called Marcus. I told him I was ready. When the trap finally closes, is it the evidence that matters most, or the moment the other person realizes they built it themselves? 4 days before Marcus was ready to move, Melissa filed the lien. I found out at 8:47 on a Monday morning when my bank sent an automated alert flagging a new encumbrance on my property title. I sat at my desk and read the notification 3 times. Then I pulled up the county recorder's website and confirmed it. Filed the previous Friday afternoon, just before close of business. Melissa Grant, as HOA president, acting under authority of the board of directors of the Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Association, had recorded a lien against my property for unpaid fines totaling $6,500, a figure that had somehow grown from $4,250 in the 2 weeks since the last notice, with no itemization attached. I called Marcus. He had already seen it. His first words were, "I know, don't do anything." I didn't do anything. But I want to be honest about what those 4 days felt like, because I think people who tell these stories sometimes edit out the part where the patience actually costs something. The federal subcontract renewal paperwork arrived in my inbox that same afternoon. Standard background check authorization form, property encumbrances, financial judgments, outstanding liens. Any of the above required disclosure and review. I filled it out honestly. I disclosed the lien. I added a 1-paragraph explanatory note describing the dispute and attaching the county inspection report. Then I sent it and waited. The client's compliance officer called me the following morning. She was professional and not unkind. She said the encumbrance had flagged for review and that pending resolution of the dispute, the renewal would be placed on hold. Not terminated, on hold. There was a difference, she said. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat in my office in a house I owned outright, with a clean inspection report in a labeled folder, listening to the refrigerator hum. And I thought about the word hold and what it cost per day in delayed contract value. Then Gary, the neighbor from the far end of the community who had texted me weeks earlier about his HOA fees, posted in the neighborhood's online forum. A long post. He had apparently not been satisfied with my silence during the earlier exchange and had decided that my continued refusal to open the shelter for board review was holding the entire community hostage to one person's stubbornness. He tagged my address. He used the phrase something to hide twice. The post received 11 responses before Patricia replied calmly that the county had already inspected and cleared the property, and could Gary point to which specific safety concern remained unresolved. Gary did not respond to Patricia, but the post stayed up, and I received 2 more texts that week from neighbors I'd never had a problem with, both carefully worded, both essentially asking whether there was something I wanted to explain. I didn't respond to any of them. Marcus called on Wednesday evening. He said we were ready. The complaint was drafted. The evidence package was organized. He had spoken to the county attorney's office, which had already been quietly interested since the Zoom incident, and they were prepared to receive a formal submission. He asked me if I was sure about the timing. I told him the lien had been sitting on my title for 4 days. My federal contract renewal was on hold. Half my neighborhood thought I was hiding something, and a wireless camera that didn't belong to me was still running in my elm tree. I told him I was sure. Is there a specific kind of cruelty in making someone prove their innocence in public? And does it feel different when you finally realize the person who forced that on you is the one who actually had something to hide? I want to tell you about my father for a moment. He was a carpenter, spent 40 years building other people's homes in a small town in eastern Colorado where everybody knew everybody, and your reputation was the only currency that actually mattered. He used to say that a man's property was the one place in the world where nobody had the right to make him feel small. Not a boss, not a bank, not a neighbor. You came home and you closed the door, and whatever was inside those walls was yours. Your effort, your history, your proof that you had shown up and worked and built something. He died 2 years before I bought this house. I wish he had seen it. I thought about him a lot during those 4 days with the lien on the title. Not in a sentimental way, in a very specific, practical way. The way you think about someone whose lessons you are actively applying under pressure. Because what Melissa had done underneath all the bureaucratic machinery of it was try to make me feel small inside the one place I had built specifically so that nobody could do that. She had taken the language of safety and community and responsibility and used it to construct a story in which I was the problem, in which my home was a threat, in which my neighbor's wariness was reasonable and my own documentation was stubbornness. She had tried to make me a stranger in my own yard. And the thing that kept me from reacting too early, the thing that kept me filing and logging and waiting instead of swinging, was understanding that if I responded to her noise with noise of my own, I would spend the rest of my time in this community defined by that fight, defined by the argument, not the outcome. People remember how things felt before they remember who was right. I had watched it happen to Patricia, who had been fined into a kind of defeated quiet that made me angrier, honestly, than anything Melissa had done to me personally. I did not want Patricia's outcome. I did not want a settlement, a retraction, an apology, a reduced fine. I wanted the complete version, the one where every person in that community understood exactly what had been done and by whom, with enough documented evidence that it couldn't be softened or reframed or quietly forgotten at the next board meeting. My father built houses that were meant to last. I intended to do the same thing with this. The Larimer County Attorney's Office scheduled a formal review hearing for a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after Marcus submitted our complaint package. The venue was a county administrative conference room. Fluorescent lighting, a long table, water pitchers, the particular stillness of a room where decisions get made and recorded. Present, 2 county attorneys, a code enforcement supervisor, a financial compliance auditor, representatives from the HOA's law firm, Melissa Grant, Doug Fielding, Carol Hess, Marcus, and me. Melissa arrived with a fresh binder and the same practiced composure I had watched her deploy in every public setting since this began. She sat across the table, uncapped a pen, and looked at me once with an expression that said she still believed she was the most prepared person in the room. Marcus opened by submitting the complete evidence package, 47 exhibits organized chronologically, tabbed and labeled. He asked for 15 minutes to walk the room through the sequence. The county attorneys nodded. He started at the beginning. Exhibit 1, the HOA's original governing documents as filed with Larimer County, showing the bylaw structure as it existed when I purchased the property. Exhibit 2, the amended bylaws submitted under Melissa's tenure with Section 14.8 highlighted, a section that had no record of a membership vote, no notice to homeowners, and no adoption documentation of any kind. One of the county attorneys wrote something down before Marcus had finished his sentence. Exhibit 3, the written notice sent to me citing Section 14.8 as enforcement authority. Exhibit 4, the county inspection report signed by Dale Hutchins. No violations found. Storage compliant with all applicable codes. Marcus read the line aloud and let it sit in the room for a moment. Exhibit 5, the HOA Community Board posting describing my property as under active safety review. Posted 11 days after the clean inspection. Exhibit 6, the quarterly meeting presentation slide showing my home address beneath the header Unresolved Property Concerns. Active review, cross-referenced with the meeting minutes showing I had not been notified of that meeting. Melissa's lawyer leaned toward her and murmured something. She shook her head slightly. Exhibit 7, the contractor work order signed by Melissa Grant as HOA president, authorizing a private property assessment billed to HOA operating funds. With no board vote record, no member notice, and a total expenditure exceeding the bylaw threshold for unilateral presidential spending by 400%. The financial auditor opened a laptop. Exhibit 8 through 14, HOA bank records obtained through the county's investigative authority, showing a pattern of unauthorized expenditures over 14 months, surveillance equipment, legal consultations billed as administrative fees, 2 contracts awarded to a property management firm partially owned by Melissa's cousin, a conflict of interest not disclosed to the board or the membership at any point. Melissa's lawyer was writing rapidly now. Melissa herself had stopped writing entirely. Exhibit 15, the lien filing. Marcus noted the date, the amount, the absence of itemization, and the timeline, filed 4 days before the statutory cure period had actually expired under Colorado HOA law, rendering the filing procedurally invalid on its face. Then Marcus set down his folder and picked up a different one, he said. The remaining exhibits relate to an unauthorized surveillance device installed on the public easement adjacent to Mr. Walker's property aimed at his private residence, transmitting over a network registered to Melissa Grant's HOA administrator account. The room went very quiet. He placed the device's technical specifications on the table. He placed my security system's detection log, showing the exact date, time, and network signature of the camera's first appearance. He placed a photograph of the device in the tree taken by a licensed investigator Marcus had quietly retained 2 weeks earlier, with GPS coordinates confirming its position on the public easement. Then he placed the transcripts. 12 pages, time-stamped, cross-referenced to the security system's transmission logs. Every conversation my system had captured while the device was active and board members were reviewing its feed. He did not read all of them aloud. He read 3 excerpts. The first was Carol Hess asking whether the camera had picked up anything useful yet. The second was Melissa's response, "Not yet, but it will. And when it does, we won't need the lawyers anymore." The third was a conversation from 6 days before the lien filing, in which Melissa and an unidentified third voice discussed 2 properties on the east side of the community by address, described their owners as motivated to move if fines were structured correctly, and referenced a contact at a real estate investment firm who was ready when we are. Marcus closed the folder. He said, "Mr. Walker did not file a complaint because he was difficult, or because he had something to hide, or because he was unwilling to cooperate with legitimate oversight. He waited because he wanted to be certain, completely certain, that what he was seeing was a pattern and not a misunderstanding. What you have in front of you is the pattern. Every item in this package was generated by the board itself. Every document was signed, filed, recorded, or transmitted by the people sitting across this table. Mr. Walker didn't build this case, they did." He looked at Melissa. "He just kept it for them." I had one thing to add. I had thought about whether to say it. I decided I owed it to the room, not to perform, not to posture, but because it was the truth, and the truth had earned the right to be said plainly. I looked at Melissa and I said, "You told my neighbor I refused every reasonable request. The county inspector cleared my property the same week you filed an anonymous complaint against it. I sent you a written warning before any of this escalated. You had every opportunity to stop. You chose not to. Everything in that package is the record of that choice." She didn't respond. She didn't look at me. The county attorney closed his folder and said the office would be initiating a formal investigation. He asked Melissa's lawyer whether his client wished to make a statement. The lawyer said they would be consulting before responding to any further questions. On the way out, Doug Fielding held the door for me. He looked like a man who had been trying to decide something for a long time and had finally, too late, decided. I nodded at him and walked out into the afternoon. When everything finally lands on the table in the right order, does justice feel the way you thought it would? Or does it mostly just feel like quiet? The lien was vacated 19 days after the hearing. The county recorder's office sent a confirmation by mail. I held the document for a moment, then filed it behind the original lien notice in a folder I labeled Resolved, and put the folder at the back of the stack. The federal subcontract renewal came through the following week. The compliance officer called personally. She said the encumbrance had been cleared and the review was closed. She didn't mention anything else. She didn't need to. The contract was reinstated at the same terms. I thanked her and went back to work. The county investigation took 4 months. The financial auditor's findings were thorough and, by the end, not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. Unauthorized expenditures totaling just under $31,000 over 14 months. 2 contracts awarded without disclosure to a firm connected to Melissa's family. HOA fine revenue redirected through an administrative account that had no oversight mechanism because Melissa had quietly removed the dual signature requirement 8 months into her tenure. Another amendment with no membership vote on record. The surveillance camera alone generated 3 separate criminal referrals. The board voted to remove Melissa before the investigation formally concluded. The vote was 4-0. Doug Fielding was the first to raise his hand. Civil suits followed from 6 homeowners, including Patricia, who had been fined a combined total of over $9,000 under policies that the county determined had no valid legal basis. Melissa settled most of them within 90 days. The criminal proceedings moved more slowly, as they do, but they moved. Fraud-related charges, unauthorized use of association funds, unlawful installation of surveillance equipment. She entered a plea arrangement 14 months after the hearing, restitution, probation, a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board in the state of Colorado. Her lawyer released a statement describing the outcome as a resolution. I thought that was a reasonable word for it. A new board was elected in a special session attended by 38 of 42 households, the highest turnout in the community's history. They spent their first 3 meetings doing nothing except reviewing every bylaw amendment made during the previous 2 years and removing the ones that hadn't been properly adopted. Section 14.8 was gone by the end of the first meeting. Patricia planted a new garden bed that spring. She didn't ask anyone's permission. Nobody said a word. I replaced the cedar fence section that had been cited in the second HOA notice. Not because it needed replacing, but because I wanted to. New boards, same line, same posts. It took me a Saturday morning. When I finished, I stood in the yard with a cup of coffee and looked at the shelter hatch sitting flush in the ground near the back fence. Exactly where it had always been. Exactly what it had always been. A storage room, emergency supplies, documents, equipment, the most boring thing on the property. The only real danger in this neighborhood had never been underground. It had been sitting at the head of a folding table in a beige room, running meetings that nobody was allowed to question, signing her name to things she believed no one would ever read carefully enough to use against her. She was wrong about that. What does it cost a community to stay silent while one person rewrites the rules? And what does it take before enough people decide the cost is finally too high? If this story felt familiar, if you've ever lived next to someone who mistook a title for permission, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're in the middle of something like this right now, document everything, date everything. Keep the emails, the receipts, the notices, the timestamps. Let them keep going. They'll build the case themselves. But here's what this story was really about. It was never really about a storm shelter. It was about what happens when someone discovers that a small amount of authority, real or invented, goes completely unchecked. When the people around them stay quiet long enough that silence starts to feel like permission. When the rules become whatever one person says they are, because nobody has bothered to read the original document. Melissa didn't fail because she was unlucky. She didn't fail because she ran into someone smarter or more powerful or better connected. She failed because she fundamentally misunderstood what she was dealing with. She saw a quiet neighbor who didn't push back, and she read that as weakness. What she was actually looking at was patience, discipline. Someone who had spent 20 years learning that the most dangerous response to a threat is often the one you don't make until the moment is exactly right. She assumed that social authority was the same as legal authority. She assumed that confidence in a room was the same as being correct. She assumed that if she kept moving fast enough and loud enough, nobody would stop to check whether the foundation underneath all of it was real. It wasn't, and every step she took to strengthen her position, every notice, every fine, every amended bylaw, every contractor work order, every camera she installed to catch someone else, became another brick in a structure that was always going to collapse inward. She didn't get caught despite her actions. She got caught because of them. The evidence wasn't gathered against her. It was generated by her. That's the part that matters. The protagonist in this story didn't win by being aggressive or clever or lucky. He won by being consistent, by treating every document as permanent, by understanding that systems, legal systems, financial systems, governance systems, leave trails. And trails tell stories. And stories told in the right order, in the right room, have a weight that no amount of social confidence can outrun. He won because he never confused the desire to react with the wisdom to wait. Most people have met some version of Melissa, maybe not in an HOA, maybe at work, maybe in a family, maybe in an institution that was supposed to protect them. Someone who learned early that if you say something with enough authority, most people won't question it. Someone who got away with it once, and then again, and then started to believe that getting away with it was the same as being right. The quiet ones, the ones who document, who keep the emails, who write down the dates, those are the ones that kind of person never sees coming. Until they do. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer in the comments. At what point in this story would you have stopped waiting? And if you're honest with yourself, would moving sooner have actually made things better, or would it have just made you feel better? That distinction matters more than most people realize. If you stayed with this story all the way to the end, there are more coming. Stories about patience, documentation, systems, and the specific kind of justice that arrives not with a confrontation, but with a folder. I'll see you in the next one.